Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending this important discussion. My name is Jacqueline Carroll. I am honored to serve as chair for the Simon Wiesenthal Center Midwest Region's Community Engagement Committee, and will be facilitating this discussion. The Simon Wiesenthal Center is a Jewish global human rights organization researching the Holocaust and hate in a historic and contemporary context. The center confronts anti-Semitism, hate and terrorism, promotes human rights and dignity, stands with Israel, defends the safety of Jews worldwide, and teaches the lessons of the Holocaust for future generations. The Community Engagement Committee is comprised of volunteers from different races, ethnicities, and religions who work together to promote tolerance and to fight to eradicate prejudice, racism, and anti-Semitism. To commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, the committee has been hosting a 6-part series throughout the year. Our first 3 panel discussions delved into the topics of the Nuremberg trials and international human rights law, religious intolerance and genocide, and Nazi hunting. After all, this is the Simon Wiesenthal Center. All of those panels dealt with more of the justice aspect of the Holocaust and other genocides. Tonight's presentation is a little bit different. Tonight's presentation is about the intergenerational impact of trauma in families of survivors of events like, but not limited to, the Holocaust. As a committee, we realized that we had a lot of family members that survived the Shoah, the Syrian genocide, and other seriously traumatic events. These events did not only affect our grandparents, parents, or in-laws, but they affected us, their children and grandchildren. The idea that trauma can be passed down the family tree, not only psychologically, but also biologically, was something we wanted to learn more about and thought we should share with the community at large. To do so, we have 3 amazing panelists to share with you. They are going to discuss the psychological, biological, epigenetic, and personal standpoints regarding intergenerational trauma. After I've read our esteemed panelists' biographies, I will facilitate a discussion with them, and I will save the last 15 to 20 minutes of this hour-long discussion for audience questions. If you have a question, please send them to me via chat, and I will do my best to have your questions answered. First, Dr. Yael Danieli is a clinical psychologist, victimologist, pioneer traumatologist, and the founder of the International Center for the Study, Treatment, and Prevention of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. She is also the director of the Group Project for Holocaust Survivors and Their Children. Dr. Danieli has conducted extensive psychotherapeutic work with survivors and offspring on lifelong and multi-generational post-trauma adaptation, optimal care and training, and on reparative justice. She created the Danieli Inventory for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma, which provides scientifically valid assessment and comparative international study. Dr. Danieli served as a consultant and expert on victims' rights and optimal care for the International Criminal Tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda and the International Criminal Court. She is the Emerita Distinguished Professor of International Psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and in 2008, she was appointed advisor on victims of terrorism for the Office of the UN Secretary General. Dr. Brian Diaz grew up in India and received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. His research investigates the neurobiology underlying stress, depression, social behavior, and fear in rats, lizards, fruit flies, and mice. Brian's research seeks to understand how mammalian neurobiology, physiology, and reproductive biology is impacted by stress and how parental legacies of stress influence offspring. Dr. Diaz is an assistant professor of pediatrics, USC Keck School of Medicine and Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. Brian was awarded the Sifar Israeli, I hope I'm saying that right, Global Scholar Award by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research in 2017 and was recently named a fellow in Sifar's Child and Brain Development Program. His studies have been featured in Nature, the BBC, and he gave a TED Talk on halting legacies of trauma. Finally, Brian teaches neuroscience to Buddhist monastics and was part of an amazing conversation on consciousness and epigenetics with the Dalai Lama. Mona Kayashana's grandparents survived the 1915 a Syrian Christian, Armenian, and Greek genocide, and escaped to Iraq. Born in Kirkuk, Mona and her family had to escape Iraq during the ruthless regime of Saddam Hussein and immigrated to the United States in 1977. Mona is a radio and TV host of The Mona K Show, an author, speaker, and executive director of The Power of Three, a Christian nonprofit organization. Mona tells the story of her escape in her book called Look Beyond the Fire, Daily Life Under Saddam's Regime. Mona is actively working to raise awareness to the plight of the persecuted Middle Eastern Christians to save them from the imminent threat of total annihilation. Mona is married to Deacon Wilson Oshana and has 3 adult boys. And I apologize, it's Brian Diaz and not Diaz. I apologize, I said his name incorrectly. So thank you for agreeing to participate in this discussion. I'm so excited to have you speak. And Dr. Danieli, I'd like to start with you. You helped create the first program in the world to study Holocaust survivors and their children. Can you please explain what you have discovered as to how trauma is passed on through generations?
In those days, I was working on my first doctoral dissertation on the psychology of hope. And I was trying, and I divided them among myself and all my students at Brooklyn College. Different population with different intensity of challenge to hope, to learn from them the phenomenological experience of hope and how it affected their lives. So they took the quotes easier cases, and I took Nazi Holocaust survivors, terminally diagnosed cancer patients, and POWs. And part of what happened was, and I believe in studying phenomena where they are. So I study, for example, people in people's homes, not just in my office or in a laboratory. But my students, for example, also went to car stops and interviewed people who just missed the bus. And you'd be surprised what can happen to people because they miss a bus and how it challenges their hope. So we immediately learned that what seems easy, it only seems, right? Because the meaning we attach to it makes the difference. But that's about that. And when I went to Holocaust survivors' homes, that was at the time, 3 of us were teaching at Brooklyn College. You would know the other 2 names. Yafa Eliach, who studied Jewish identity and the Holocaust, and Dr. Ruth, who were teaching in the health department, and myself. And Yafa helped me find survivors who my doctoral committee told me, they don't talk to anybody. Why do you believe they would speak with you? Well, guess what? I would come to a survivor's home. I will not tell you about the cancer population and the POWs, that's a whole, because you want to know about Holocaust survivors. I would come to a survivor's home. They would seat me where? Jacqueline?
At the
Where
table.
would they seat me?
At the table.
In the kitchen.
In the kitchen, at the table. Yeah.
In the kitchen. And those people who were supposed to not speak to anyone spoke and spoke and spoke. I rarely left before the next morning. It was as if they waited for somebody who was willing to listen. And they basically told me, and that was a scientific finding of 100%, that nobody would listen to them or believe them. That even when they went to therapy, which was rather strange for people from the quotes old world, even in therapy, the therapist then listened or found all kinds of ways to change the subject when they would speak about their Holocaust experiences. Well, I was a very idealistic graduate student. And here were people who anyone in the world would agree deserved all the help the world should have given them. And they shared with me that they weren't listened to, they were shunned, they were shut up, etc. And so I got quite distressed and outraged. And so several things happened out of that. One, I added a dissertation on the what I call the conspiracy of silence, of what makes good people not listen.
Mm-hmm.
Even more so, people who by their contract are supposed to listen in order to even try to understand, not listen. So that is published. A lot of what I'm talking about is published, and those of you who are interested in reading more, I promise Jacqueline that I will share with her my list of publications or whatever. You can get them all.
Thank you. Can I ask you?
Now, let me just close this piece.
Okay.
So as a researcher, I committed to study the conspiracy of silence. As a clinician, I, with others, and with, for example, Lisette Lamont-Fink, who herself was a survivor psychotherapist, created the group project for Holocaust survivors and their children. It's Holocaust survivors first. And we didn't charge because nobody ever trained us to do this work. Of course, nobody was trained. So we sort of figured, we are the students. We know how to facilitate, but they really know, they are the experts on their experiences. So it's a fair exchange. At any rate, what happened was not only survivors, but their children got into the conversation, of course. And they said also the conspiracy of silence harmed them too. And they told all about what it was like to grow up in survivors' homes and how it affected them. So as a scientist again, I started studying what I saw as differing adaptational styles in survivors' home. Because at the time, there was only one concept, that was the survivor syndrome. And people started talking about child of survivor syndrome. And I said, excuse me, I am not seeing a syndrome. I'm seeing people who have adapted to life. The whole life was shaped by the experience. So I named that post-trauma adaptational styles. Mm-hmm. And I wrote about 4 different ones that I saw at the time. One was I called the family victim style. These are the families who clung to each other, who would get all tensed up whenever anything unusual, what they thought was unusual, was happening. They wouldn't, they clung to each other, and they protected each other from the world, etc. Again, you should really read about it. This is not for 10 minutes. The second style I saw was I called the fighter style. These are the people who are ready to fight. And not only they anticipate fights even when if they're not there. So each style has its adaptive qualities, and we pay for when we adopt a certain style. The third style I call the numb style. They were actually the most tragic families in the sense that they lost everyone, including their own children. And I categorically can share with you my observation that has not changed for half a century, that the loss of a child in front of your eyes when you are totally unable to do anything to help is a wound that we simply don't heal from. We can adapt, but the wound is open. It's not, that wound is not a healable one. And the fourth style I called, in quotation marks, those who made it. These are the survivors who looked like nothing ever happened. They took the number first thing out of their arms when they came to Israel, or mostly to America. They denied any relationship to the Holocaust. They single-mindedly decided, consciously or not, they dedicated their lives to be victorious over the Nazis. Mm-hmm. I can go on and on and on. I'm giving you little tidbits because
I'd like to just, before we move on to Brian, I want to just ask, like, one follow-up is, for example, you talked about the numb, the survivor that was numb, that continued that silence, that didn't talk about it. How did that affect the next generation and potentially the generation after that? How did that trauma, like, in essence, imprint onto the children? What did your study find? Because I know you did a multi-generational, the Daniele inventory, and you sent out a survey with like 60 questions. What was the outcome of that study?
Okay.
Yeah.
This is like years later.
Okay.
Many years later. People of other populations kept writing, when email started, right? When the internet started. Mm-hmm. People kept writing to me, Dr. Daniele, I want to study whatever, my own people, but my doctoral committees will not let me because there's no, quotes, valid instrument. So I said, well, I wrote everything I had. I know, you go ahead and do the instrument. I'll help. But as it turns out, I forgot that when we started, there were very little to read. We were learning from each other. We were looking for information. Today, after the advent of the field of trauma, there is so much that if I had to enter the field now, I'd probably be totally overwhelmed and go to something else. But at any rate, so at age 72, I said, okay, I'll do it. So I collected, working at the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, having been one of the founders and past the first woman president, I reached out to the best researchers around and said, look, I want to create a measure, help. So we did. And it's all available on our website, free of charge.
I will end up posting that website on the chat so people can find it for themselves.
You're totally welcome to check it out, etc. And we created a 3-part measure. The first part is the child reflecting on their parents' behavior, both mother and father, because again, the field started talking only about attachment to mother, forgetting that the father had anything to do with anything. So both mother and father, and their upbringing and how they were brought up. The second, and that's called post-trauma adaptational styles, right? Or parents' adaptational styles. The second part, that would be of real interest to you. I mean, everything is interesting, but personal interest. The second part I called reparative adaptational impacts. Now, the name is extremely meaningful. Reparative, I discovered very early that every child of survivors, actually every baby, every normal child, when mommy cries, what does the baby do? The baby runs to mommy to help, right?
Okay.
Some babies freeze, right, etc. But what I've discovered that at least unconsciously, but with many very consciously, children of survivors are profoundly committed to repair the world for their parents and for themselves. Okay. And that's why I called it reparative. Adaptation, of course, because I believe one adapts to the milieu the world provides you with. And the parents' adaptational styles were the milieu you were born into, right? Psychologically, biologically, socially, etc. Then impact is plural. Why? Because I believe that the impacts are from parents to children, but also from the children to their own children, right? Into the world. So it's reparative adaptational impact. It ended up after thorough study, both in North America and Israel, with 36 items that are totally not only valid, but connected with each other. And by the way, one of my agendas was always also that the Germans would not only, pride themselves for giving up and giving reparations to survivors, but I still want them to help children of survivors who might be needy of help and have no resources. So part of the secret agenda here was to create a measure, not only for general assessment in the world. This is, yes, that is my scientist heart, but also to be able to prove, quote unquote, impact, okay, multi-generational impact, so that those countries, agencies, etc., who ought to pay reparations or care for the traumas they've caused, should be held accountable.
I agree. I'm going to switch focus a little bit, because we're running out of time, and
I know that's.
I have some questions for Brian, or Dr. Dias. You've also researched ancestral trauma imprinting on descendants, but in a very different way. Can you explain first what is epigenetics, and then what is transgenerational epigenetics, and then discuss your study on fear in mice?
Absolutely. So I'd like to begin by thanking you for including me in this conversation. It's a really important one to have, and I'm delighted to be able to contribute and learn from all of you. So I'll start from the beginning. So when we think about this phenomenology that Dr. Danieli was talking about, which is intergenerational or multi-generational legacies of stress, we think there are three main ways by which they perpetuate across generations. One is through social transmission of information. So those could be stories that are told at the dinner table that then get transmitted across generations, or social transmission by way of parental behavior being influenced as a result of trauma, and then that parental behavior gets bestowed upon children. That sets up their behavioral states, and then it perpetuates like a domino effect. You could also have maternal fetal interfaces, which stress during pregnancy will have an effect on the fetus, how the fetus develops, and then that's one way by which intergenerational legacies of stress can perpetuate across generations. And now, more intriguingly and excitingly, we think that sperm and egg may bear imprints of ancestral traumas, and you can think of that as now that sperm and egg, when they meet each other to form the embryo, that embryo then develops in a multitude of ways, but with an ancestral burden of trauma, it could go down, it could develop one way and result in a suite of mental health conditions, for example. And so how might all of these converge onto a single biological mechanism by which this occurs. And so therein lies the power of epigenetics. And so we're all familiar with genetics. So I want to use the metaphor of a book. All of us are born with a book of life, and that book needs to be read in different ways. And depending on where you put a comma or a full stop or a highlight or whiteout, you're going to get a different meaning from that same book of life. And that's exactly what epigenetics does. One parental style, an abusive parent, or stress during pregnancy, or stress preconception, which might affect the sperm and egg, goes and puts in the equivalent of full stops, commas, whiteouts, highlights on specific parts of our book. And that allows for that book to be read very differently. And so then you have situations where, because of abusive caregiving, or because of stress during pregnancy, or stress in adolescence, and then preconceptional stress, you have ramifications for future generations. How do we know all of this? We know all of this, of course, from a phenomenological perspective from humans, but then we want a mechanistic understanding of that from studies involving animals. And so all the way from flies to worms to rats to mice to monkeys, we now know through epigenetics that intergenerational legacies of trauma perpetuate across generations. And so one of the studies that we did was we took mice and we made those male mice fearful of a particular smell. And so we were able to tag a particular smell as being stressful. And so the challenge with being able to study intergenerational legacies of trauma or stress is, where do you look for the imprints of that stress and trauma? And so we'd like to be able to have a baton which we can actually visualize across generations. And so the smell became that baton for us. So what we did was we made these male mice fearful of a particular smell by stressing them with a particular smell. And then we asked, how do the offspring and the grand offspring respond to that smell, and how does their brain represent that smell at a neuroanatomical level? And what we found is that the future generations are most sensitive to that smell, and their brains devote more real estate to it. So now we had to rule out the possibilities of, could this be because when we set up the matings, there was social transmission of information versus whether this was actually biological inheritance via the sperm. And so you can do these kinds of experiments in animals. And so using in vitro fertilization and a few other techniques, we were able to show that the sperm were actually carriers of information from one generation to the next. And so what in the sperm, and the current thought in the field is that, remember I talked to you about all these punctuations, full stops, commas, and you may hear about things like DNA methylation, histone modifications, RNA modifications. And so all of these are the equivalent of those particular punctuations. And what we now think is happening is that when you have a trauma, at least in the male, in the paternal lineage, you have RNAs, which are these tiny little molecules, which find themselves or get into sperm, and they then orchestrate how an embryo develops to allow for intergenerational legacies of stress to perpetuate from a biological perspective. What happens from at the level of, for example, stress during pregnancy or abusive caregiving? What we think is happening is that there are particular genes in the brain which again bear different punctuations because of these experiences, and that allows for things like the stress axis not to be shut off. And so when you don't shut the stress axis off because a particular gene which was responsible for turning it off cannot be read, that part of the book cannot be read, then you have a hyper-responsive stress response, and then you have increased anxiety, you might have depressive-like episodes, etc. And so that is, in a nutshell, how we think intergenerational legacies of trauma and stress perpetuate across generations.
So I remember watching one of your, I think it was the TED Talk, and you talked about like the Dutch winter and nutritional famine. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. So one of the most widely cited examples of intergenerational legacies of stress or trauma, and we wanted, and this is important, I think we want to define stress and trauma also broadly. So a nutritional insult is a stress or a trauma. Environmental toxins are stressors and traumas. And so we want to be inclusive in what we consider stress and trauma, especially these days. what happened was food and water was embargoed going into the Netherlands in 1944, as a result of which caloric consumption in the Netherlands fell to about 400 calories a day. And so people resorted to eating tulip bulbs. And so what happened was there were children who were in utero in mom's bellies at the time. And those children, when they grew up, they presented with higher incidences of obesity, diabetes, and schizophrenia, and cardiovascular disease. But what was even more intriguing was that the grand offspring also presented with these conditions, the grand offspring not even being conceived at that particular time. And so we don't exactly know, again, from a mechanistic perspective, how that phenomenon came about, but via the mechanism of epigenetics with these different punctuations, which might be laid down at different points in time, those particular the one particular stressor could actually have ramifications for several generations to come.
So I do have follow-ups, but I want to get to Mona, and then I will ask my follow-ups.
Absolutely.
Mona, your grandparents survived the 1915 genocide, where over 3.5 million Assyrian Christians, Armenians, and Greeks were massacred by the Ottoman Turks. Can you please discuss a little bit about how they survived, what they told your parents, and what you heard about their struggles and how that impacted you?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be able to tell my story. It's truly an honor to be among these two great, unbelievable panelists that, hearing their perspective is mind-boggling. So it is an honor and a privilege, and thank you for this opportunity. My parents came from two different villages in the Hakkari Mountains, which of course the Turks have since renamed. One village was called Eshitha, and the other one was called Jilu. Now there are many other villages in Hakkari who have survivors. It's so interesting to hear the perspective of Dr. Danieli and Dr. Dias, because we now have a name for it, and we now have a place in our hearts where we went on for years feeling this discrepancy of this sadness that we carried, and yet here we are giving it a name, finally, to be able to justify what it is that we are going through. Now, my parents, obviously, it was not very documented, and the documentation that is available in history is very vague. Unlike many of the other atrocities, of course, one that is very well known that the world would hope that would have learned their lesson by saying never again, of course, was the Holocaust. But here we have a 1915 genocide of basically annihilation of the Christians from the Turkish government. My parents, or my grandparents, survived having lost all of their family members. They survived by luck, really. There was no strategy. There was no escaping. It was just everyone was escaping for their lives. And if they were caught, they were obviously slain by the sword. And if they, escaped, they escaped. My grandparents, that from my mother's side, walked to, out of Turkey to go towards Urmia, which is in present-day Iran. And from there, I believe it's hard to kind of map out. But on their way, my grandmother had a 12-year-old brother, who was also a deacon. He drank some of the waters that was on the way, because again, these are people escaping with just the clothes on their back, drank the water that was available to them on the road, and was poisoned. It was poisoned water, and knew he was dying. And he performed his own funeral, and basically laid down on the floor, crossed his arms, and told his sister, my grandmother, to leave.
Sorry.
And they abandoned him and left him there. And, Christians, we bury our dead. And it's a ceremony of a send-off, as a bride meeting her groom to heaven.
we have such a ceremony that he was deprived of that, and so many thousands of Assyrians that were deprived. And my grandmother on my father's side, who is from the village of Jili, buried two brothers on the road, and wrapped them in her own clothing to bury them. And she buried them. She dug burial sites on the road and buried them. So again, this is not something I witnessed. I'm the third generation of the atrocity. But nevertheless, the stories that were handed down to us, as you can imagine, are just as emotional and painful. And so as Assyrians, I wish I can say 1915 was the genocide that we speak about in historically, but it's not. The Assyrians continue to struggle. And as you are all seeing now with the social media, with the televised events that's happening, the Assyrians continue to struggle, because after before 1915, there was the Badr Khan massacre of 1846, which again, my village, my ancestral village, Eshita, was affected, again, Tiare in Hakkari, 1915, and then once again, the Semele massacre of 1933, perpetrated by the Iraqi government, where we had escaped to. So you can see the continuation. And of course, since 1933, the annihilations of the Christians, the animosity that we've been called traitors of the nation. And from that point on, Assyrians have lived in their native homeland since the beginning of time, since the Assyrian Empire and before that. Everyone knows the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, and that's how far back we date. And we still speak the ancient Aramaic language, and our liturgy is in that language today. And yet I wish I could say I'm a third generation survivor, but I'm a first generation survivor of the Saddam Hussein and ISIS and other atrocities. And now my kids are second generation. So it's an ongoing story that has not ended. And the sad part is it's not very documented. And we have remained obscure. We have remained abandoned. We have remained as if we don't exist. And yet here we are, coming to America and finally finding our voice to say enough is enough. And, it's no longer an option to say, you need to stay silent, because even in America, we were silenced based on the fact that what they would do to those we left behind, so we stayed quiet for far too long. And now there is merely a few thousands remaining in the Middle East. They have, almost, I can say, accomplished their goal of annihilating the Christians from the Middle East, but we are flourishing in America. And to the enemy today, I say, as a survivor, you might have tried, but you did not survive, because here we are surviving and thriving. Thank God for the Western countries and those countries that have taken us in and heard our story. And maybe our story will finally be heard and acknowledged.
Thank you so much for speaking. Actually, Yael or Brian, would you want to comment on what Mona just said in terms of like adaptational styles or the biological aspect of the fact that she didn't personally experience the genocide in 1915, but she personally experiences it as well as her own trauma. So if either of you want to comment.
Yeah, I would be happy to. And actually, Brian, that adds a fourth dimension that comes from our research to what you were describing. There is an independent effect of the actual original traumas themselves on the children, not only through the parents, but the stories of the trauma themselves and the effect of the stories. I'll give you an example, okay? We call it multigenerational linkages, okay? And I'll give you two examples of the items that people check for that. Okay, one is, I know my parents and lost family histories only in bits and pieces. Okay, so the child doesn't only live with the stories, etc., with everything you were describing, but also with the lack of it, with the lack of the connective tissues, with the lack of the coherent understanding, and that in itself. And another item for the the broken linkages is, I think of my parents as my parents, not as my grandparents. Okay, so it's as if you position yourself as if you never had grandparents. You come from the void, or from the loss that was created. So this would be a good conversation for us to have as an additional source, traumatic source for the offspring, for children, grandchildren, etc. That's almost regardless of what behaviors, what stories. Again, I don't know which commas and periods, maybe a semicolon for that one, but so yeah. So when Mona, when you were speaking, and in fact, when you are feeling, that's what I'm talking about. Actually, she's mourning it 106 years later.
True.
She's grieving it as if it happened, right? In her being, it's just, it happens every time she tells it. Okay, so that's...
I'm so sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. It's just that when my mother told it, she cried. And so that emotion, I feel like, was instilled in me. And so I feel like every time I tell the story, I have to cry.
Okay, so that goes to the social one, to what Brian was talking about.
Yeah.
So, but this is very interesting because we can really analyze in detail. We can really pay a lot of attention, and we ought to, the complexity of these experiences. There's another layer of what you were talking about, which is multi-generational. Was it a trauma in 106 years ago? No, what you're saying, it wasn't just a trauma 106 years ago. There are cumulative traumas within again, we're talking almost about the Black experience in America and the indigenous experience in America, now that we're talking about systemic, right? Systemic oppression. You know, it continues and it repeats and it accumulates. And that's a different phenomenon that I'm not sure we've been accounting for. So some of us call one transgenerational and one's inter or multi-generational. There's a lot more to think through, to be true to these amazing phenomena.
So what would you consider to be intergenerational versus multi-generational versus transgenerational trauma? Just to clarify.
I actually don't use transgenerational, but some people do. So to clarify, it's as if the experience itself comes through, right? More in line of what Brian was talking about, the sperm carries it.
Yeah.
Right? That's different from being traumatized again by maybe the same system or even a different one, and it connects to the genetic or epigenetic or the unconscious meaning of it. So I'm not having, I don't want to say that I have the answer for it. I want to say that there's a lot more to explore to be right in a multi-dimensional way. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah.
I want to know what you think.
No, I'll just say real quick. So from the inter versus transgenerational perspective, if a fetus is in utero and there's a stressor, yes, the fetus's body is affected, but so also the fetus's germ cells are affected. And so by definition, if the sperm and egg in that fetus could be affected, or the future germ cells could be affected, then by definition, the next generation is also exposed directly to the trauma. So that would be considered in our field intergenerational still. To be transgenerational, there should not be a direct exposure of that individual to a particular trauma or stressor. And so in the fetus scenario, it would be the grand offspring. If they show effects of stress and trauma, that would be considered transgenerational.
Perfect. Thank you. That's very helpful.
We have there was a question just for people to know. I see that people raise their hands and I can't let you, I don't know how to let you in. So if you can send me a Q&A or a chat for your questions, that would, I think, work better. I have, it says anonymous attendee, can the speaker comment on whether he or anyone else has studied this in the context of African-American descendants of slavery? Now, Yael was just kind of talking about that a little bit and saying it was a little bit different, but if either of you can discuss that, that would be great.
Brian, you want to take this one first?
Sure. So from a mechanistic perspective, what we're now appreciating, and I want to introduce people to something called, excuse me, an epigenetic clock. And so there's the chronological clock or chronological age, whatever our age is based on our birth year. But now we know that we have what is called an epigenetic age as well. And so every cell in your body has an epigenetic signature. A lot of people focus on DNA methylation. And so depending on the DNA methylation status, I could be 40 years old, but my cells could actually be 45, for example. And so what we're now appreciating is that stressors or traumas, including racial discrimination, does alter the epigenetic signature, does alter DNA methylation profiles that would suggest that there is epigenetic aging. And you can imagine that when a cell ages faster than it should, that's going to come with a whole host of physiological and behavioral concerns. And so people are now appreciating that racial discrimination does affect epigenetic age, but I do want to leave this particular part on a positive note, which is to also say that that epigenetic clock can be slowed down and that epigenetic aging can be slowed down by putting into place supportive ecosystems that will buffer that individual from the discrimination. So the die is not cast. Yes, we're going down a downward spiral, but we can slow down that spiral or stay in place by putting in positive aspects of ecosystems.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. And I'm, yeah, from an experiential point of view as well, this is extremely important. And yeah, the accelerated aging weakens and can compromise the immune system in many ways. And that's what we've seen. Now, what I want to share with you is that after creating the Daniel inventory as my legacy, I decided to create the International Center for the Study, Treatment, and Prevention and Treatment of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. So indeed, we want it to be as comprehensive, as multidimensional as possible. And indeed, all of these perspectives are in. And we did talk, Mona, about the Assyrians when we celebrated President Biden's signing on acknowledging the Armenian genocide. We spoke about those sister populations that have not been acknowledged yet, but the movement is there. I think it was a great impetus that he had. Now, interesting, in my book, this book I did in 1990, it appeared in 1998. It's the International Handbook of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. It has over 30 populations around the world, because what I learned from the Holocaust, I believed could help others. And so I shared it with other scholars. And this was the first book, actually, Mona, that included the Armenian genocide. And the Turks didn't like me very much.
Of course not.
It was also the first book that has a whole section on indigenous people. And the first book that had the genetics and the thinking that might develop into, right?
Yeah.
The epigenetics, which is, but at any rate, yeah, I want to sort of start from the supportive ecosystem that Brian mentioned, because it has shown to be crucial, like, of critical helping capacity. So, and that's what we should focus on when we talk about prevention, of course, and treatment. And also, one of the things that I meant to say after Mona spoke was, don't ever forgive, or don't ever forget, don't ever overlook the resilience of survivors.
Amen.
And that too goes among within intergenerational gifting, I believe. We can talk more about that, Brian, but I believe you would probably, I would like to know what you think about that. You also have evidence of that, don't you?
So I'll really quickly say, because I know we might want to get to more questions, but absolutely, you're absolutely right. What we're now understanding is that there could be some positive effects of intergenerational trauma too, in setting the child up to be, in setting the child up to deal with their own environments in a slightly better manner, to allow for, even if there's ambiguity in that environment, to be able to be jostled a little less because of what the legacy that they've been born with. The challenge for us, of course, is to know, and you articulate this really well with the different responses. We don't know who's going to be vulnerable and who's actually going to come out on the other side with post-traumatic growth. And that, I think, is the challenge for us.
Yes.
So I have a couple of questions from the audience. Judge Joel Shukak asks, says, it must be very hard to separate and quantify what trauma behavior stems from a biological basis and that which comes from a cultural upbringing basis. Has any genes or markers been identified supporting the genetic basis for transgenerational trauma?
So the one that comes to mind for me, and the one that gets a lot of attention, is what is called a chaperone protein. So chaperones are what they sound like. They're chaperoning the different hormonal systems of the body in this case. And the chaperone here is chaperoning the stress responsive system. And so there's a gene called FKBP5, and this has been studied extensively by Elizabeth Binder's group at Max Planck in Munich, and then Rachel Yehuda, who's at Mount Sinai in the context of Holocaust survivors. And so FKBP5 as a chaperone is really important, because if it is marked differently based on the legacy of trauma, you'll have a stress responsiveness which is high or a stress responsiveness which is low. And you can imagine how that's going to then allow for that individual to respond to stressors in their own lives. And we think that you obviously inherit a certain instruction, a certain sequence for FKBP5, and then the environment can interface with that particular sequence, and you can have high stress responsiveness or not. So that's what comes to mind for me.
I have another question from Susan Stern. How does it affect a child to grow up knowing their parents had a brutal history?
Knowing that? Their
parents had a brutal history, that like they survived something like the Syrian genocide, the Holocaust. Like, how does a child grow up when they're aware that this happened to their parent?
I can answer that. I mean, from my own experience, we grow up mistrusting the world. We grow up being cautious. We are more mature than other children in some cases, for the ongoing atrocities that the Assyrians experienced in Iran and Iraq and Syria and other parts of the Middle East. It's an ongoing struggle. And I want to point out to what Dr. Daniele was saying about the different styles of clinging and being fighters and losing everything. I don't know what you called that one style. I couldn't make it out. And for those who made it, we have those styles. We as Assyrians cling to each other. We don't trust other communities. We are very internal. We are very one to another, even though we have internal conflicts and we haven't been able to accomplish much because we've kept to ourselves. But nevertheless, that's what we've had to do to persevere and to be resilient and to gain bounce strength off of each other, knowing that we have this common pain, that we come from different regions. I know that Ms. Juliana Tamrazi is on, hearing. She's from Iran, and thank you again, Juliana, for asking me to be on this distinguished panel, because this is phenomenal for the Assyrian story to be told. Again, when you have other atrocities that have happened, they've all been documented, and those people of those atrocities, for the most part, have found an end to their pain, and then they have gone on probably to become those survivors, to be able to heal or to realize this many pains that we're experiencing. The Assyrian tragic story is ongoing. It's a story that continues to exist, and so. As I write in my book, Look Beyond the Fire, we had to mature so quickly that at 7 or 8 years old, I probably could tell you exactly what was going on in the political scheme of Iraq, where I would be surprised right now. My kids who are adults don't know what's going on. I mean, they're more aware, my kids, than a lot, but nevertheless, they're not aware. Awareness is there. We don't trust people. We don't let people in. We were doing the United States Census when our community heard that there's going to be people knocking on their door. You know what came to mind? Saddam Hussein and his cronies coming to knock on the door at 3 in the morning to take your brother, to take your father, to take your mother, to take whomever they thought was betraying the country. They would take them in that middle of the night, never to be seen. Of course, they would tell them, oh, we're just going to take him to the station and question him. That person would never be seen. So this is the reality of those that survived and continue to struggle. So there is really no relief. It's an ongoing struggle.
Yes, that's part. And may I add that under reparative adaptational impacts, for example, what you see and what Mona says fits perfectly. You see what we call reparative protectiveness, right? Everybody protects each other. Insecurity versus competence. You have to always be competent. You have to always be in control.
Is that angrier as well? Would you say that you have to be, that the children who feel this way also feel a little bit angrier?
Hold on. Then you have also defensive psychosocial constriction, what she described. They closed off the doors. They do have a need for power and control. They have obsession with the trauma. And you see sometimes one of the costs you pay is that you see immature dependency. It's like they're sort of all, they cling to each other, which is what I described. So if you are very high on those factors, you have trouble. But again, what's very interesting, what Mona spoke about at 7 years old, she already could figure out the environment. Holocaust survivors' children at age 3 or 4, they were the American negotiators, right? And they negotiated the American environment. So they, at 3 or 4, when you're asked to write a check, it's sort of like overwhelming. And or if you have to talk to the German consulate or all kinds of other things with the American realities, you might grow up with a feeling of I can't, and not know that at age 4 or 5 it was totally acceptable not to be able to write a check.
Mm. Brian, you were
But
about
the experience of I can't sort of colors and might end up compromising your brilliant career. Because while you could be totally brilliant, the feeling of I can't could hold you back.
And if I may, the resiliency to survive wasn't where we hear the crimes that our parents or our grandparents endured, wasn't as Christians, and yet we still remain Christians following the guidelines of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. There is never revenge in our heart. It's really unique in that sense. It's not revenge. It's victory and survivorship. It is, you killed my my ancestors, but I will prove to you that my ancestors will live on in me and others that have survived by the victory that we are alive today. That's why I started out by saying, for the enemy that thought they could annihilate us, because as a nation, the Assyrians continue today to thrive. And that in itself, that victory of survivor is not revenge, but it is to say, you might have tried, but you did not succeed in annihilating us. So that to us is a great victory.
Brian, you were starting to say something, sorry.
Right, so I just wanted to provide some biological texture to 2 points that we're talking about. So one, Mona used two phrases, words, we matured faster and we grew up faster. And it is intriguing to me that she says that, and maybe she knows the literature already, but we now know that depending on the time of exposure, in utero, it actually slows down aging. But if the trauma is experienced postnatally in the first formative years, it actually accelerates aging. And that's shown by earlier menstrual cycles in girls. It's shown by molars coming up much faster. It's shown by DNA methylation marks, showing a speeding up of aging. And so I found it remarkable, the congruence using words like maturing and growing up faster. And then the second point that I want to make is windows of development matter. And so if we're to have any promise of breaking legacies of trauma, there are 2 times where we have the best chance to do that. One is in early infancy and the other is in adolescence. And so those critical windows of development are where a lot of things are happening. Not that the ship has sailed at other times, but it's tougher to do. It's just like learning a language. People can learn a language in adulthood, but it's a little tougher. So infancy and adolescence are those 2 epochs where we have the maximal chance, and which is why we need to invest in whatever programs we can at those particular points in time.
How do you break the legacy?
So from a perspective point of view, these are the optimal times.
But how do you break the legacy? How do people heal? Like if someone's grandparents or parents survive these horrible atrocities, and it's potentially already in the next generation's body or environment, the nature and the nurture, how do you get those people, the children of, the grandchildren of, to heal? How do we break that legacy?
So maybe I'll just take this really quickly. So I want you to, so as Yael was saying, we never forget, and neither should we. So the body never forgets. The highlights, the punctuations that were laid down, they're laid down. But guess what? Another page of the book can be read by the supportive intervention that's put into place with attentive parenting or caregiving that might occur at a period of time. So say if pages 1, 3, and 5 of our book were marked by the trauma, yes, they might be marked by the trauma. But then if David Attenborough comes and reads in his sonorous voice pages 2 and 8, it can just elevate you to a completely different level. Not that you've forgotten that 1, 3, and 5 are not read, but now 2 and 8 create a completely different texture for your life. And that's the positive aspect. But then the challenge is also to have David Attenborough reading that all the time and never go away. And that's the challenge with having to have our social initiatives in place, that they're on 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, because all it takes is very, very, very few triggers, and all of those emotions, all of those triggers come back?
So let me share more of our findings. Our study took place, as I said before, both in North America and in Israel. And it came out that children of survivors in Israel did far better in terms of their own well-being than North American ones, even despite necessary, for example, economic advantages in North America, etc. And part of what we speculated and people verbalized, articulated, was that in Israel, in both places, they were post-trauma safety, offered safety, right? But in Israel, there was a return to millennial continuity, which means the resilience was built into the visual of it. Also, the purpose of living was bigger. It's to build a home for the Jewish people, rather than not only to build a home for my family. It's a different, and many other differences, but again, please read the actual research because it's so much richer than what we managed to utter here. So, and for example, I therefore recommend very strongly to all the research that's done today, like let's say in Bosnia, with the inventory in Bosnia or in Kosovo or in even in India actually, that both people should be studied both in the diaspora and in what they experience as a homeland. So, that just one more important connection of and source of resilience, perhaps.
And I'm going to put your website on the chat right now. It has the research, and I'm going to do the same thing for Brian. Do you want to put yours in the chat as well? Just so in case anybody wants to learn more, and Mona, if there's anything you want to put in the chat as well, so people can learn more about your stories. I know we're already 10 minutes past.
Oh, I told you it will never be done
now. Thank you, Brian. Instead of asking another question, I'd like it if there's anything that you guys want to give as parting words. And then if anyone wants to go first. Oh wait, I see the people have raised their hands. I just, I can't see what, just because you're raising your hands, I can't see what you're asking. So I apologize for not being able to have you come on and ask a question. But so yes, Mona, Brian, Yael, if there's anything else that you want to add to end this conversation, please do so now.
Mona, you start.
Okay.
Okay. Once again, I mean, I am beyond grateful to be able to have this opportunity. It is not very often that we get this opportunity to tell the story. As we said, silence is no longer an option. All that the enemy planned to do has already done it. And we are at the point of extinction. I appeal to the world. I appeal to the United States of America. I appeal to every country, everyone that is hearing my voice, to open your heart, open your eyes, and open your ears. There is a nation that is epic, that is historical, that has contributed so much to the world, that is about to disappear. We need a point of contact. We need a point of reference. The Assyrians today, still people are asking, who are the Assyrians? When all you need to do is Google or go to a nearby library or just look at your phone and just Google the Assyrians and you will see the contributions that were made. Today, we are rising from the ashes. We are a stateless nation that might have been taken over by the many brutal governments that have come and taken over the lands that we occupied, known as Mesopotamia. But Mesopotamia, Assyria, the empire of Assyria lives within us and in our children and in our bloodline. We will survive, we have survived, and we will thrive, and we have victory. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you once again. I am humbled by this panel. Jacqueline, thank you so much for your moderation. You are unbelievable. Thank you to all of you for having us today. It is truly humbling to be among you. Thank you.
We stand with you, and we're so appreciative to hear your story.
Thank you.
There's a reason why she founded We Persist. She is
Yes.
extremely persisting.
Yeah.
I truly welcome all of you to engage with the center. Brian, you're totally welcome. Mona, you're totally welcome to be an active part of it, please. So be
Absolutely.
I put my email. Brian, can you be in touch with me and Mona?
Yes.
And whoever else, please. If I don't answer right away, which is normally how I operate, it means I'm taking care of whatever. So be patient and don't worry about being a pest. I need pestering. So.
Well, I will hound you, because now that I've discovered there's a name to what condition that we have, believe me, I will be looking you up to find out more about it.
Not only that, we're also involved in advocacy, and I think you need the support of other groups who have been able to resist together, and there is strength in numbers. There is no question about that. Not just in politics, also in in supportive eco environment.
Very true.
So Jacqueline, you did it. I'm humbled too, which is not an easy thing at my age.
And then
I look forward to having you around too.
Absolutely, my new friend. Brian, you have anything else?
Yeah, I'll just say again, I'm humbled to be part of this conversation. I want to thank you, Jacqueline, for inviting me and for including me. I'll just say that biology affirms everything that we've talked about, and I think that's important to have that affirmation. But where I want to see us going is for biology to also affirm that legacies of empathy, kindness, and compassion, something that I ended my TED Talk with, also can halt legacies of trauma, and for biology to affirm that, because in that we have the capacity to be able to halt legacies of trauma, and we need to invest in our children both at infancy as well as in adolescence if we're to have any hope to put the brakes on these legacies of trauma.
Totally important. I want to add one more thing, just to share one of the most beautiful memories of my life. After the genocide in Rwanda, I was invited there. As you sort of know, I've been working in the terrible places of genocide, and there was one meeting. I was helping with reparations. That's part of my expertise. So at the end of one meeting, Ibuka, which is the umbrella organizations of survivors of Rwanda, asked, it said the following to me, and I want you to feel it as I say it. They said, Dr. Danieli, would you please bring Holocaust survivors here to teach us how to live after death?
Yeah.
Wow.
We did, not only Holocaust survivors from Israel, Europe, and North America, but Armenians, including second and third generations, Cambodians, New Bosnians, and all other genocide groups, indigenous people. And so I want to share that with you. It was the most meaningful meeting of my life. because you had the support. You brought it up to me, Brian, and this girl's persistence. The support can come from different survivors groups to other survivors groups, you see, right. Because they almost have a built-in compassion and empathy. Sometimes it's misused in a sense of they say, I understand exactly what you mean, which is a way to shut people up.
Yeah.
But they do have that kind of inner experience of having met the abyss that brings them together. And they help each other find the words, which, Mona, is part of what you said, right? I now have a word to use, to describe. So there's such a good feeling here. So I wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
I'm going to end this discussion, although very reluctantly. But what you were just talking about, that's what the Simon Wiesenthal Center Midwest Region's Community Engagement Committee is all about. We are all races, we are all ethnicities, we are all religions, we are all colors. It's important for us to see our similarities instead of our differences, and to focus on helping each other and promote tolerance amongst everyone. That's our goal. And hopefully we accomplished a little bit of that today. And hopefully for those watching, this has been recorded. Please share it with your friends, share with your family, share it on social media. I think it's just so important that this message gets across. I do want to thank, first of all, Allison Pierce-Loven, who's the director, and Abby Asher for helping with everything technically. I want to thank members of my committee. I want to thank Mitch Goldberg, whose idea this was, Juliana Tamaruzzi, who brought Mona on and who's just a rock star and amazing, to Judge Megan Goldish, Nancy Zars, Sean Tenner, Bob Schwartz, Enza Ranieri, Sharon Hatchett. I'm sorry if I'm missing anyone. I'm hoping I got everyone. But on behalf of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Midwest region and myself, I am so grateful that we were able to have this discussion and that everybody decided to join. And especially to my panelists, to Brian and Yael and Mona, you guys have been amazing. And I'm so grateful to know you and to learn from you. So thank you.
You brought us together.
Thank you.
Thank you.